The overarching theme of this mono blue deck is unmistakable. We want to draw cards. We want to draw a lot of cards. Since the primary focus of this deck is drawing cards, there are numerous win conditions tied to this dynamic, including the potential of winning while drawing cards from an empty library. If, by chance, this plan stalls, then there are powerful and game-ending creatures present in the 98 which can forge alternate paths to victory. Eligeth Crossroads Augur is a 5/6 Sphinx with flying for 4 and 2 blue mana. If we would scry a number of cards, we draw that many cards instead. This replacement effect makes scry spells and effects even more valuable, as these cards are put straight into our hand, as opposed to putting any number of them on the bottom of our library and the rest on top in any order. With Eligeth in play and under our control, scry spells suddenly become more economically costed and much more impactful than true card-drawing spells. Sakashima of 1,000 Faces is a 3/1 human rogue for 3 and 1 blue mana. We may have Sakashima enter the battlefield as a copy of another creature we control, except it has Sakashima's other abilities, the most important of which is that the legend rule does not apply to permanents we control. The legend rule is the rule that states that if a player controls 2 or more legendary permanents with the same name, that player chooses one of them, and the rest are put into their owner's graveyards. Sakashima lifts this restriction. The vast majority of creatures that Sakashima can copy in this build either strengthen our scry into drawing cards Eligeth-led engine, or pose massive battlefield threats to our opponents. Either way, Sakashima's presence in the command zone enhances our chances of winning the game. Note that if Sakashima becomes a copy of Eligeth, then we will not draw twice the number of cards from each instance of scrying, since this is a replacement effect. However, we would have 2 copies of Eligeth, which makes spot removing the cornerstone of our build even more of a challenge for our opponents. The partner pair of Eligeth Crossroads Augur and Sakashima of 1,000 Faces won MTG Burgeoning's Tournament of Partners, a months-long YouTube journey that pitted 16 randomly assigned pairs of legendary partners against each other in a bracketed single-elimination tournament. The MTG Burgeoning community voted for their favorite pair during each contest, and the last pair standing was Eligeth and Sakashima. As the inaugural winners of this Tournament of Partners, an EDH deck was sculpted around this winning pair with the intention of keeping it as a playable option. Although the 98 has shifted and changed since this deck's inception, the partner commanders cannot. The MTG Burgeoning community crowned these generals, and we will remain loyal to them. Crafting a land base for a monocolored build allows us to not be preoccupied with mana fixing, while opening the door to a wider range of utility options. For the purposes of this build and this theme, we want our lands to produce blue mana, as well as provide any peripheral forms of resource development and thematic synergies. With these guidelines in mind, let's begin the 98 of this deck with some utility land options. Reliquary Tower may be the most important land in this deck. It gives us no maximum hand size. In a build that is dedicated to drawing cards, keeping these cards in excess of 7 is vitally important. We do not want to discard any of our cards at the end of our turn. Cards in hand equals problems for opponents. Cards in the hand of a blue mage equals headaches for these same opponents. We can pay 2 and 2 blue mana and tap Castle Vantress to scry 2. But if Eligeth is on our side of the battlefield, we draw 2 cards instead. Castle Vantress comes into play tapped unless we control an island, which should not be a problem here. Mystic Sanctuary enters the battlefield tapped unless we control at least 3 islands, and when it comes into play untapped, we may put target instant or sorcery card from our graveyard on top of our library. This is a great mid to late game land play for the purposes of recurring a needed spell from our graveyard to the top of our library, which then should easily be put into our hand through Eligeth's ability. Speaking of putting a card into our hand, if we tap and sacrifice Command Beacon, then we put our commander into our hand from the command zone. This helps to mitigate any commander tax accrued by either of our generals, at least for a turn. Through Otawara Soaring City's channel ability, we can pay 3 and a blue mana and discard this land to return target artifact, creature, enchantment, or planeswalker to its owner's hand. This channel ability costs 1 generic mana less to activate for each legendary creature we control. Note that this bounce ability can target our permanents as well. Urza's Saga is, well, a saga, and when it comes into play and after our draw step, we put a lore counter on it. The first lore counter allows us to tap Urza's Saga for 1 generic mana. The second lore counter allows us to pay 2 mana and tap it to create a 0/0 colorless construct artifact creature token with this creature gets +1/+1 for each artifact we control. When the third and final lore counter is put onto this saga, we sacrifice it and search our library for an artifact card with a mana cost of 0 or 1 and put it into play. Although its presence on the battlefield is temporary, Urza's Saga leaves behind up to 2 artifact creatures and a very valuable artifact. Since we're playing mono blue, all signs point to Island being the most featured land in this deck. But it's not. Eligeth has a healthy mana value of 6 and should be a popular target for removal among our opponents. Since mono blue is not a popular color for mana ramping, we need an outside-the-box approach secondary to the ramping up of our land base. With that in mind, let's replace the islands in this build with snow-covered islands instead. This is why. When Extraplanar Lens comes into play, we exile target land we control. Whenever a land with the same name as the exile card is tapped for mana, its controller adds 1 mana of any type that land produced. In any monocolored deck, Extraplanar Lens can provide a massive boost in mana resources if utilized strategically. It is far less likely than any of our opponents with blue in their EDH decks are playing with snow-covered islands instead of islands. This way, we restrict the double mana producing lands to just snow-covered islands, of which we have 25 in our deck, while our opponents, most likely, will have none. Continuing our ramp spells, we have Jeweled Lotus, Mana Crypt, Chrome Mox, and Mox Opal. Jeweled Lotus can be tapped and sacrificed to add 3 mana of any one color, but this mana can only be spent to cast our commanders. Mana Crypt has an upkeep trigger that deals 3 points of damage to us if we lose a coin flip. Through its imprint mechanic, when Chrome Mox comes into play, we exile a non-artifact, non-land card from our hand. We can tap it to add 1 mana of any of the exile card's colors, which in this instance would be blue, of course. Mox Opal can tap to add 1 mana of any color, but it can only do so if we meet its Metalcraft requirement of controlling at least 3 artifacts, which should be easier than Sunday morning in this build. Next up are Mana Vault and Soul Ring. Mana Vault taps to add 3 colorless mana, but it does not untap during our untap step. We can pay 4 generic mana at the beginning of our upkeep to untap the vault. At the beginning of our draw step, if Mana Vault is tapped, then it deals 1 point of damage to us. No commentary needed for Soul Ring, as it is probably the best artifact in our format. We can pay 1 generic mana, tap and sacrifice Moon Silver Key to search our library for an artifact card with a mana ability, or a basic land, and put it into our hand. Mind Stone taps to add a colorless mana, or we can pay 1 mana, tap it, and sacrifice it to draw a card, while Arcane Signet taps to add 1 blue mana in this build. Thought Vessel provides redundancy secondary to having no maximum hand size. It is the artifact equivalent to the aforementioned Reliquary Tower. For one-and-done sources of mana acceleration, we have Lotus Petal and High Tide. Lotus Petal acts as a treasure token, meaning that we can tap it and sacrifice it to add 1 mana of any color. Until end of turn, whenever a player taps an island for mana, High Tide has that player add 1 additional blue mana to their mana pool. Although these sources of mana are temporary, the results of their impact could resonate throughout the game. Bringing our ramp section of this deck tech to a close is Sapphire Medallion. Although it does not necessarily ramp our mana, it reduces the cost of our blue spells by 1 generic mana, which allows us to cast them ahead of curve. We have our share of spot and mass removal spells here, and they begin with Pongify and Rapid Hybridization. These instants cost 1 blue mana, destroy a target creature that cannot be regenerated, and create a creature token for its controller. Pongify creates a 3/3 green ape, while Rapid Hybridization creates a 3/3 green frog lizard. Reality Shift costs 1 and 1 blue mana and exiles target creature, and its controller manifests the top card of their library. To manifest, the player puts the top card of their library onto the battlefield face down as a 2/2 creature. If it's a creature card, then it can be turned face up any time for its mana cost. For the same mana value as Reality Shift, Resculpt exiles target artifact or creature, and its controller creates a 4/4 blue and red elemental creature token. For mass creature removal, we have Curse of the Swine. We exile X target creatures, and for each creature exiled this way, its controller creates a 2/2 green boar creature token, a swap we are almost always willing to make. Spectral Deluge returns each creature our opponents control with toughness X or less to its owner's hand, where X is the number of islands we control. We can cast this sorcery for 4 and 2 blue mana, or we can pay 2 generic mana and exile this card from our hand face down, and then cast it on a later turn for its foretell cost of 1 and 2 blue mana. Speaking of returning cards to our opponent's hands, no blue deck is complete without a copy of Cyclonic Rift. If we pay its overload cost, then we return each non-land permanent we don't control to its owner's hand. The following economically costed counterspells are included for the purposes of protecting our generals, as well as denying our opponents any type of interaction during our eventual game-winning turn. These spells also synergize with, enhance, and preserve our spell-slinging theme. As long as we control a commander, we may cast Fierce Guardianship without paying its mana cost. It counters target non-creature spell. Force of Will takes it a step further. It counters target spell, and we may pay 1 life and exile a blue card from our hand rather than paying the 3 and 2 blue mana cost for this spell. If an opponent casts 3 or more spells in a turn, then we may pay 0 instead of paying Mindbreak Trap's mana cost of 2 and 2 blue mana. It exiles any number of target spells. Note that Mindbreak Trap exiles spells. It does not counter them, which allows us to interact with spells that say cannot be countered. They will not be countered in this instance. They will be exiled instead. We can return 3 islands we control to their owner's hand for Thwart. We may discard an island card and another card for Foil. With Disrupting Shoal, we may exile a blue card from our hand with mana value X to counter target spell if its mana value is X. We should have numerous cards in our hand, and it is quite likely that we will have a card that equals the mana value of our opponent's spell. Pact of Negation has no upfront cost. We pay 0 mana to cast it, but at the beginning of our next upkeep, we must pay 3 and 2 blue mana or we lose the game. Most likely, we should not need another upkeep when we choose to cast the Pact. For just 1 blue mana, Swan Song and An Offer You Can't Refuse counter different types of spells. Swan Song counters enchantments, instants, and sorceries, and its controller creates a 2/2 bird creature token with flying. An Offer You Can't Refuse counters non-creature spells, and its controller creates 2 treasure tokens. Aside from our suite of scry spells turned into draw spells, we do have traditional sources of card draw for the purposes of creating thematic redundancy and alternatives to gameplay, particularly if Eligeth is otherwise indisposed and languishing in the command zone due to overtaxation. Whenever an opponent casts a non-creature spell, Mystic Remora has us draw a card unless that player pays 4 generic mana. At the beginning of our upkeep, we put an age counter on this enchantment, and then we sacrifice it unless we pay 1 mana for each age counter on it. An early to mid-game Mystic Remora can put a lot of cards into our hand, as long as we continue to pay its cumulative upkeep, of course. If we would draw a card except for the first card we draw during each of our draw steps, then Teferi's Ageless Insight has us draw 2 cards instead. This card drawing boost can get out of hand very quickly in this type of build. Whenever an opponent draws a card, Consecrated Sphinx allows us the option of drawing 2 cards. Rhystic Study taxes each spell an opponent casts by 1 generic mana. Failure to pay this tax results in us drawing a card. Failure to remove this enchantment from the battlefield results in our opponents incessantly hearing us ask the question, are you going to pay 1 for that? Pull from Tomorrow has us draw X cards and then discard a card. Tolarian Winds is a rummage spell that has us discard our hand and then draw that many cards. Occult Epiphany is a looting spell with a creature token producing bonus attached. We draw X cards, discard X cards, and then we create a 1/1 white spirit with flying for each card type among cards discarded this way. In this deck, we can create a maximum of 7 spirits with this card, which gives us an instant speed evasive offense, a versatile defense, or both. For another one-and-done mass card drawing effect, Seagate Restoration has us draw cards equal to the number of cards in our hand, +1, and gives us no maximum hand size for the rest of the game. As an option, we could play the backside of this card and put Seagate Reborn onto the battlefield. When it comes into play, we may pay 3 life. If we don't, then it comes into play tapped. Versatility reigns supreme with this sorcery, as it provides mana if needed, or a potential game-winning spell. Before showcasing our suite of scrying spells, which Eligeth will eventually turn into card-drawing spells, let's take a moment to explain how these specific spells were chosen. The most important factor here was the amount of mana invested versus the number of cards scryed. We want a return of more than 1 card scryed per 1 mana spent. This way, we are outpacing traditional blue card drawing spells, which generally provide 1 card or less drawn per 1 mana spent. We want the biggest Eligeth guided bang for our mana invested buck. With this in mind, and assuming that Eligeth is on our side of the battlefield, we begin with a host of spells that cost just 1 blue mana. Preordain, Serum Visions, and Mystic Speculation draw us 3 cards. We also can buy back Mystic Speculation by paying an additional 2 mana as we cast it. If we do, then we put it into our hand as it resolves. Deliberate, Scour All Possibilities, and Omen of the Sea draw us 3 cards. Scour has a flashback cost of 4 and 1 blue mana, which means we can cast a spell from our graveyard and then exile it upon resolution. We can pay 2 and a blue mana and sacrifice Omen of the Sea to draw 2 cards. We can tap Maze Mind Tome and put a page counter on it to draw a card, and when there are 4 more page counters on this artifact, we sacrifice it and gain 4 life. If we take this route, we can draw 4 cards with the Tome. 4C and Tamiyo's Epiphany draw 6 cards each. The cards drawn by Eugen's Insight varies, but it should be able to put a considerable number of cards into our hand. Eugen's Insight has a Scry X, where X is the highest mana value among permanents we control, and then we draw 3 cards. Specific to the cards in this build, Eugen's Insight could draw us up to 14 cards for 5 total mana. Since we have established a Spell-Slinger type theme for this build, installing some spell-slinging payoffs strengthens our theme further through the peripheral advancement of our board state and resources. We can create creature tokens whenever we cast an instant or sorcery spell with Murmuring Mystic and Talrand Sky Summoner. The Mystic creates 1/1 blue bird illusions with flying, while Talrand creates 2/2 blue drakes with flying. Metallurgic Summonings creates XX colorless construct artifact creature tokens, where X is the instant or sorcery spell's mana value. We also can pay 3 and 2 blue mana and exile Metallurgic Summonings from the battlefield to return all instant and sorcery cards from our graveyard to our hand. We can only activate this ability if we control at least 6 artifacts, which will not be difficult in this build. Returning a graveyard filled with cantrip and counter magic spells should be quite demoralizing for our opponents and invigorating for us. Shark Typhoon extends its token-producing ability to any non-creature spell we cast, which nearly doubles the amount of spells that could create XX blue shark creature tokens with flying, where X is the spell's mana value. In a pinch, we have the option of cycling Shark Typhoon out of our hand for X1 and a blue mana in order to draw a card and create another XX shark with flying. For additional card drawing options, we have Wind Rider Wizard and Archmage Emeritus. Whenever we cast an instant, sorcery, or wizard spell, Wind Rider Wizard allows us the option of drawing a card. If we do, then we discard a card. This looting effect helps us rip through our library as we look for one of our win conditions. Archmage Emeritus simply draws us a card whenever we cast or copy an instant or sorcery spell. As mentioned previously, if Sakashima were to become a copy of any of the aforementioned creatures, it would help to strengthen the spell-slinging dynamic present in this build. If he were to become a copy of Kozilek the Great Distortion or Ulamog the Infinite Gyre, then he doubles up a massive threat already present on the battlefield. Kozilek is a 12/12 with Menace, which means that he cannot be blocked except by at least 2 creatures. It would take 2 unblocked attacks by a Kozilek-copied Sakashima to knock an opponent out of the game with lethal commander damage. Also, let's not overlook the ability that makes every card in our hand a potential counterspell. As a copy of Ulamog, we have a 10/10 indestructible creature with Annihilator 4, which means that whenever he attacks, defending player sacrifices 4 permanents. Imagine attacking one opponent with 2 copies of Ulamog. That opponent must sacrifice 8 permanents before they even consider blocking assignments for 2 10/10 indestructible Eldrazi. That is the power of Sakashima. Also note that if Ulamog is put into the graveyard from anywhere, then we shuffle our graveyard into our library. This ability allows us to keep revving our card-drawing engine. If one copy of Jin-Jitaxi's Core Augur prompts our opponents to pull out their Salt Shakers, then 2 copies of it should force them to haul out their Salt Licks. At the beginning of our end step, we draw 7 cards, which we would do twice because of Sakashima. Our opponent's maximum hand size is reduced by 7. So, in this scenario, during one round of turns, we are drawing a minimum of 15 cards, while each opponent ends their turn with no cards in their hand. This chasm-like disparity in cards should equate to a walk-in-the-park victory each and every time. Yes, this deck is going to get hated off the EDH table, but it's a mono-blue deck. What did our opponents expect? With a deck focused on drawing a lot of cards, it makes sense to include various win conditions that deliver victory through this process. Whenever we draw a card, Psychosis Crawler has each opponent lose 1 life. Plus its power and toughness are each equal to the number of cards in our hand, making it another formidable threat on the battlefield and a great creature to be copied by Sakashima. Whenever we draw a card, we put a foreshadow counter on Ominous Seas. We can remove 8 foreshadow counters from this enchantment to create an 8/8 blue Kraken creature token. We also have the option of paying 2 mana and cycling this card away from our hand in order to draw a card. Speaking of drawing cards, let's include Laboratory Maniac and Jace, Wielder of Mysteries, as alternate win conditions. If we would draw a card while our library has no cards in it, which is a very reasonable outcome in this deck, Labman and Jace win us the game instead. Thassa's Oracle provides another way to win the game with few or no cards in our library. When it enters the battlefield, we look at the top X cards of our library, where X is our devotion to blue. We put up to 1 of these cards on top of our library and the rest on the bottom in a random order. If X is greater than or equal to the number of cards in our library, then we win the game. To factor our devotion to blue, we count the number of blue mana symbols and the casting costs of permanents we control. Once more, we add another win condition dependent on depleting our library down to nothing or next to nothing. It's a feat that this deck accomplishes very, very easily. Although it does not synergize directly with our card draw dynamic, Omniscience makes the facilitation of this engine so much easier. We may cast spells from our hand without paying their mana costs. With Eligeth on our side of the battlefield, we can draw handfuls of cards at a time through our slate of scry spells, and we will not have to pay any mana to do so. Not to mention, all of our counter magic spells are also free to cast. With Omniscience, we are almost assured victory, and we should consider this enchantment to be the most important and powerful card in the 98. Now let's showcase a few more cards that synergize with and enhance our Scry to Draw theme. If Leyline of Anticipation is in our opening hand, we may begin the game with it on the battlefield. We may cast spells as though they had flash, which means that we can cast them at any time we could cast an instant. This is beneficial to us because we can leave mana up at the end of each of our turns and play around our opponents. Library of Lang provides additional redundancy in the no maximum hand size department. It also has an ability where if an effect causes us to discard a card, we have the option of discarding to the top of our library instead of into our graveyard. Lightning Greaves gives equipped creature haste and shroud. Protecting our commanders, especially Eligeth, is vital to the theme of our deck. However, let's not overlook the haste enablement of this artifact. Equipping the Greaves to Sakashima after it enters the battlefield and becomes a copy of Kozilek or Ulamog could be the difference between knocking an opponent out of the game, or at least greatly hindering their side of the battlefield. The last card of this deck tech is Noble Benefactor. When he dies, each player may search their library for a card and put that card into their hand. Notice the text here. These cards are not revealed. Our opponents will not know which card we put into our hand. Yes, we will not know which cards our opponents put into their hands as well. Are we worried? Not at all. We will have a grip of counterspells in our hand just in case our opponent's choices are hazardous to our health. Our first choice should be Omniscience. With this enchantment on our side of the battlefield, we should be nearly unstoppable. Hopefully, our opponents will not stop playing Magic with us in the future. This Eligeth and Sakashima build has been added to the Burgeoning Commander Catalog, and this video also becomes the starting point of an Eligeth and Sakashima EDH deck video primer series. These playlist series can be accessed in the description below, on our YouTube page, or at the end of this video. The Burgeoning Commander Catalog is my personal collection of EDH decks. An EDH deck video primer series showcases the continued evolution of a deck through future appearances on the Up and Up series, during which we update and upgrade decks featured on this channel. The full card list for this build can be found in the description, and be sure to share your thoughts about this Eligeth and Sakashima deck in the comments section below. This is MTG Burgeoning, yo channel for all things Magic.